In all Shaivite monasteries, one law presided over all others, the strictest obedience to the Guru. Through adhering closely to the word of the Guru, and even to the unspoken thoughts projected telepathically to the artisan by the Guru, and moving immediately with the direction, the monastics endeavored to capture the power behind the Guru's instruction, a power aided by inner-plane devas specially commissioned to work with each Guru. In this way, the Mathavashis or monastics were able to work intuitively and effectively in the external mind, fulfilling and communicating any mission bestowed on them with ease. Those who could not capture and work with their guru's power were considered of a beginning nature and performed day-to-day mundane functions until they matured. Om. Rains condensed upon earth at the beginning of the Dvapara Yuga to form a large body of water previously held in the atmosphere, dividing once connected lands into continents. In the absence of the Guru's appointing a successor, the monastery would be dismantled and the monks dispersed. The power within these sanctuaries came from a profound source, obedience to the preceptor, a power that would wane in the Kali Yuga. Gurudeva. Chapter 18. Guru and Disciple. Though our planet now is divided by a great mass of matter that has condensed from the atmosphere and now sits turbulently on the earth, hitting the earth where it touches, we are told on another culture forming and changing quite rapidly on the other side of the planet, and that Shaivism is becoming different according to the nature of these tribes and what they are now facing. Since we are on the side of the planet where most of the strongest Lemurian temples existed, our culture is more similar to the Lemurians than theirs is who live on the other side of the planet. Reorientation of a guru's monastics. Our gurus, of which there are many, have many monasteries, and when one of them lets his physical body down because he needs it no more, his monastics close their monasteries, take them completely apart, and take down the wall, leaving the darshan to hover on the great lake that they installed. All work on this, even the surrounding population of the monastery, and then the monastics move into the monasteries of another guru or gurus, dividing themselves up into small numbers. They seek entrance by their wall, they seek admittance as beginning sadakas, and when they are admitted they are always beginning sadakas and can never be initiates, even though they may have been initiates in their guru's monastery, because initiation is the seeing of one's guru in his resplendent form, while looking at his physical body, and then the knowledge which is the guru enters the disciple. This can, of course, only occur with one's own guru, so in their entering the monastery of another guru, they do so only as servants, and take a most humble position to live out their destiny in the physical form. Proportionately, they bring to the monastery some of the devas of the inner order, and they become servants to the devas there who hover around the presiding guru of that monastery. The guru overseers of Shaivism. Proportionate to the population, gurus do appear, and proportionate to the number of monasteries, one guru is able to manage with his transcendental powers. This is arranged by the band of gurus themselves in the second world, as they govern Shaivism in our land. Our prophets say that in the Kali Yuga, this band of gurus will divide itself into smaller groups, as the earth will be divided into smaller groups due to this condensation of our atmosphere into solid mass, which we cannot cross over. The guru's power. In working within the monastery, one law presided over all others, and that is the strictest obedience to the guru. This was called working with the power of the guru. His direction and the force he gives, along with the direction, must be captured, and in being captured, the direction is accomplished with ease. Our greatest initiates were those who were able to capture and use the power that accompanied the direction the guru gave. Even the second world devas worked in this way with the guru. Those who could not capture the force and move immediately with their guru were considered simple servants of a beginning nature and performed the day-to-day mundane functions. One who captured the power of any direction given to him and performed it in immediate obedience to fulfill the mission bestowed on him, and then after a while ceased to fulfill this function and work with the direction given long after the power had waned, was awarded strong tapas without explanation from his guru. and he had problems within himself finding his guru. And when he found his guru within himself again, another mission would be bestowed upon him, and if he captured the power of it, his tapas would have been ended. It is only in this way that the Shaivite guru works and serves and fulfills his mission, for he and he alone knows the preordained pattern that must be woven by all initiates and sadhakas within his monasteries to create a collective force strong enough to send them as individuals off the planet when the time is right and their bodies are needed no more into another galaxy. Guru's constant presence. Our gurus constantly moved from place to place. We never knew when they would arrive or when they would be with us. It is almost impossible to feel should they leave. Therefore, each monastery feels the presiding guru is always there, feeds him daily, and all is in readiness to meet his needs. Often and more than often, he did not make his presence known, except to the senior minority group. But occasionally he would give special instructions to the initiates and sadhakas alike, and all activities of the monastery halted to listen, to learn, and to receive missions, personal instruction, and great blessings, concluded with festivities and celebration. The Guru's dynamic presence. Many of these monasteries are so large that the Guru can travel through areas of the monastery and be incognito, as the sadhakas had never met him. He would work with them in milking the animals, or sitting by the wall, mingling in and through and among them. If those who knew him saw him doing this, they would not call attention to him in any way, but pretend they also did not know him, for it was known that each guru made himself known to a sadhaka or aspirant when his time was right. In one or two of his more senior monasteries, each guru took a prominent position, especially at the monasteries from which the strongest darshan emanated. These monasteries were generally small and more intimate in nature, and their primal function was simply the generating of darshan in disseminating it all to the other monasteries, whereas the other monasteries disseminated the darshan to the population at large. Fulfilling assignments from the guru. Our gurus rarely taught except by instruction that was to be carried out in the strictest obedience and immediate spontaneity. The teaching came from the divinic world within on the power of the guru that was issued when the instruction, direction, or mission was given. It was through this method that we were able to perform many functions in the external mind for the population that surrounds our monasteries, without realizing that we are effectively working within the external area of the mind at all. This we call grasping, owning, and working with the power of the guru. Our gurus basically only emit this one power to fulfill the mission. It is for us, without putting our personal mental structure in the way of it, to grasp it, to use it, and to fulfill the direction of the assignment. For this is why we are in the monastery, and this is why the monastery exists at all. Disobedience predicted in the Kali Yuga. Our prophets say there will be times in the Kali Yuga when the mind force will be so dense that the guru will give direction and the monastics will not heed either the direction or the power of it, and turn their monasteries into more ordinary places than those of the population which surrounds them. But at the end of the Kali Yuga this will change, and be again as it is now, and that our monastics will appear again, as will our guru be obeyed, the power caught and the mission and direction fulfilled in issuing in the Shiva Yuga, and that Shaivism will flourish round the world. Meeting in covert conclave, the senior minority silently governed the flow of activity within each monastery, and when they met in private, their very bones became a chakram through which the deities and devas would work to polarize that ray of light and love from within known as the darshan. The 4 divisions of the monastery were taught to function as the 4 major currents within the body. The north took care of all religious activities, holy ceremonies, and milking animals. The East Wind monastics headed the religious education, both within the monastery and to the elder family men in the community. The South Wind monastic was the craftsman, gardener, and caretaker. The West Wind group handled all business. The senior minority anonymously governed this flow of activity. Aum. Rains condensed upon earth at the beginning of the Dvapara Yuga to form a large body of water previously held in the atmosphere, dividing once connected lands into continents. In the absence of the Guru's appointing a successor, the monastery would be dismantled and the monks dispersed. The power within these sanctuaries came from a profound source, obedience to the preceptor, a power that would wane in the Kali Yuga. Guru Deva. Chapter 19. The Senior Minority Group. In each of our monasteries, the senior minority group silently governed the flow of all activity and polarized the darshan. Each one was governed from a distance by one member of the senior group who was other than our guru's assistant in the monastery and his two helpers. Appointed by the most senior member of the group, each of these members, who were closest in connection with one of the four divisions, inwardly edited the darshan flow of that division, and if it was not correctly handled, the artisan or artisans were called to meet the senior group, sit, meditate, and harmonize the vibration. In our smaller monasteries, the senior group took an active part in all the affairs, and if the group was small, perhaps one would be appointed to oversee the inner flow of two of the divisions. It was only in our large, well-established monasteries that the senior group could sit back and totally work within the inner force field of the monastery, because the monastics were so well trained, artisans so efficient, that automatically, without effort, each one, doing his part, the external and internal activities moved in perfect synchronicity. It was only in these monasteries that the senior group remained the same, with few fluctuations and changes. They are elderly and wise, cautious and strong, and converse quite openly with our guru. The four winds of the monastery. The Guru looks at each of his monasteries as he would one person. If there is anyone who stands out apart from the others, it shows a problem is imminent and more training is needed. So since there are four major currents in our bodies, carried with us fully intact from the planet that we came from, the four divisions are taught to function as these currents do. We relate them to the wind from the east, the wind from the north, the one from the south, and the west wind. Our Guru, of course, holds counsel mainly in the Akasha. He is the Akashic wind. Only with anyone he might appoint to work with him for a time on specific innovations. Therefore, each of the four members of the senior group is not in charge of the division or wind of the monastery. He simply feels the flow and observes the physical plane activities, keeping himself, of course, incognito, as does everyone in the senior group. It was always considered a break in the flow of transparency to be discovered as a member of the senior minority group, especially by young sadhakas who had to be trained to inwardly approach the devas of our monastery for their help and stabilization, rather than personalities within our monasteries. North, east, west, and south wind duties. It is the north wind Shaivite monastics that take care of all religious activities, special pujas and ceremonies, preparing the prasadam and milking the animals. The east wind monastics are in charge of religious education within the monastery itself and provide a continuing education for the elder family members in the community. It is the West Wind monastic group that handles all business in relationship to the surrounding community and the acquisition of goods, as well as the disbursement of them, and the South Wind monastic is the artisan, the craftsman, the builder. He produces all that is to be produced to sustain our culture. The duties of the senior group. Each monastery enacted the divine play. The Guru Shiva himself, dancing through the Akasha, speaking only with the most senior of the monastery, his divine son of wisdom, Uma Ganesha. The Uma Ganesha has two helpers. One is Shiva's servant, Hanuman, whose great mission is to bring souls to Shiva. He is the host of new guests, the overseer of the wall. He addresses the entire monastery and voices the Guru's words whenever necessary. The least senior, the Umadeva, the carrier of messages, was often seen during a gathering of the senior minority group of the monastery, running out, finding and bringing someone to sit with the group, an artisan perhaps, a newcomer who had been living by the wall. He was always at the right hand of Uma Ganesha, and in the circle the Deva sitting next to him was his assistant too, as was the one sitting next to the Hanuman, the assistant Hanuman. Their assistants shared some of the responsibility, especially if the monastery was new, for at this time the senior minority group assumed an administrative function, as the core of the new monastery was made up of members of the senior group of another monastery or monasteries. and they knew all that had to be done in building a new, strong, fine Shaivite monastery. As the training persisted, and as fine artisans were brought in and the winds all became strong in their function, this group retreated more and more within the inner core, having to authorize less and less innovations of new growth, and concerned themselves mainly with the comings and goings of sadhakas and guests. The great calendar of activities. The Ganesha efficiently reported all that occurred to Shiva, his guru, each time they met, and kept close follow-up on all important events, activities, monastic discipline in the great calendar log of the monastery, according to the formula by which the senior minority group was chosen. If a new member entered into the vibration of Ganesha, this calendar of our future was passed over to him, losing no continuity of the most minute of events. Gatherings of the senior group. Each time the senior minority group gathered, it gathered secretly, and all were present at this holy event if they were within the monastery walls. Occasionally the inner forces were found to be strained or taut, and the Ganesha would hold special vigil, and they all sat together for long periods of time in prayer and meditation in an area apart from anyone else. Occasionally Shaivite gurus would ask that the senior minority groups in all monasteries hold vigils together for long periods of time in prayer and meditation in an area apart from everyone else. Occasionally Shaivite gurus would ask that the senior minority groups in all monasteries hold vigils together in silent inner workings with the forces to cause fusion of these forces, thus strengthening the darshan flow in his chain of monasteries, which he worked with himself quite regularly by traveling from one to another. Cleaning is ashrama sadhana. It was the Hanuman's assistant that sought out the Guru if the Guru could not be found, to handle important issues. He arranged meetings with the Guru and the Ganesha and saw to all the Guru's needs when arriving in the monastery, during his stay and upon his departure. During this time he was relieved of all of his other duties. It was the assistant to the Deva who was in charge of the great sadhana of our monastery, that of cleanliness and beauty. This ashrama sadhana brings contentment and life to the doer as well as the viewer of beauty, an intrinsic part of our culture. By keeping our monasteries in absolute order, a physical plane magnetism occurred, drawing others to our walls. If no one sat by our walls or came up to them to be lectured to through the holes in the walls, if our crops failed and the abundance of our needs did not enter our storerooms, we always worked diligently to increase the magnetism through the perfection of our culture, bringing love, harmony, cleanliness, and beauty into each minute area. Those on tapas are 6 years old. The divine family, Shiva, Ganesha, and the Hanuman, was not without the other son, Balamurugan, who was represented in many faces and forms by devas wearing yellow on tapas of a nature that changed their monastic age to that of 6 years old. Each one in yellow is treated as a 6-year-old, and when the senior minority group was computed by the youngest member of the monastery, whom we called the Vadivel, the third son of Shiva, the age of 6 years old is always taken into consideration. A sadhaka in white accumulated his monastic years, but when performing tapas of a certain nature, he is 6 years old as well. He too could wear the 108 Rudraksha beads on Mahatapas, and as the yellow deva on this tapas, he would be taken completely out of the monastery flow as in the Akashic wind. Working with his guru, coming out of Mahatapas, he would go through a re-entry period in the monastery of living by the wall for a moon, a philosophical test given by the senior minority group, along with a welcoming ceremony entered him into the monastery again. Customs and attitudes of Mahatapas. When a deva is wearing yellow on tapas as Balamurugan, he assumes the attitudes of youth and joy and happiness, spontaneity. But even though his monastic age is adjusted during these tapas, his resident time within the monastery is not and remains the same. However, on Mahatapas in our monasteries, when the 108 Rudrakshas beads of our Lord Shiva are worn, after the re-entry ceremony, residency time begins to accumulate as if he was just arrived from another monastery. This only applies, however, if the Mahatapas has lasted one full moon or more. During Mahatapas, food is given to him where he lives, and he lives alone. He does not speak. He looks within and sits for long periods of time at the foot of the pedestal in our temple. He is ignored by everyone and left alone, by himself with his guru and the deity who works silently within him. To begin the Mahatapas, a ceremony is conducted before the pedestal under the direction of our Guru. The deity and devas are informed that this tapas is being commenced. No time is set for the duration of the tapas. It is the Guru who begins the tapas and ends it, and when it is ended, a ceremony is held at the threshold of the pedestal. Deity and devas are informed that the tapas is ended. Special care of the youngest monastic. The youngest member of the entire monastery in physical age and brahmacharya age, as well as monastic age, is carefully sought by the Ganesha, and constantly reports are given to the Guru as to how this Vadavel is faring. He is given favors, gifts, love, care, and attention. He is Shiva's third son, represented by the trident. He is the one who is trained to calculate exactly who is a member of the senior minority group each time there is a change in the comings and goings of the monastery population. He is the youngest and most blessed, and is always taken care of by the Hanuman's assistant, as well as cared for by him as to his rest, his food, and his training. Vadavel and the Umadeva. A young deva would only become a Vadavel, and each monastery has one, after one moon by the wall, philosophical test, and entrance ceremony. He's invited to sit with the senior minority group after this only at times when everything is going well within the monastery and the darshan flow is perfect. When he joins the circle, he sits directly opposite the Ganesha. When the Guru joins the circle, he sits between the Ganesha and Umadeva, for the Umadeva helps the Guru as well with his assistant carrying special messages, and is always at the Guru's right hand when he visits the monastery to run errands for him. Not the head of the monastery. The senior minority group is able to hold the vibration of the entire monastery because they've lived in it the longest and have been monastics in one monastery or another longer. This group is not the head of our monasteries, our Guru is, and they take a most humble position of obedience under his radiance. Occasionally, the worldliness of the externalities and over-involvement in things or people allows one to take the position of heading up the monastery, especially if the Guru has many monasteries and his visits are rare. When this is discovered, he is always placed on tapas or asked to pilgrimage to another monastery. Thus the Gurus of our race and time stand upon the head of the serpents of our ego. Overseeing timing and sublimity. It is the artisans, those highly skilled, trained beings, and the executives of the West Wind and North Wind monastics, and the teachers of the East Wind that actually keep the monastery productive. The senior minority group sees to the overall darshan flow, that the timing is right, that the artisans are performing correctly, and through the great calendar log, that not too much occurs at one time, and that all major occurrences happen in line with similar occurrences in the second world, and sometimes deep in the third. Our Guru accepts each of us into the monastery through the senior minority group. We are therefore all here because of his grace, and when it is time for us to leave this spot, taking down our walls and leveling it all into a lake, he will tell us, and we will do so without question. Harmonizing negativity in a wind. The senior minority group is not the head of these Shaivite monasteries. They carry out the edicts of our Guru. They are the receptacle of the vibration. All positive power is channeled through them, and negativity too. They read it through their nerve system. They determine which wind a negativity might be coming from and call in an artisan or executive Brahmin or Mohan or Swami so that he can report as to the problem he is experiencing. The forces within him are harmonized by sitting with the group. If his problem cannot be solved through the shastric rules governing the monastery, the solution is sought for through the Ganesha to the Guru himself. for it was important that the Ganesha keep in constant contact with his guru. Most of the time he was the only one in the entire monastery, including the senior minority group, who knew where his guru was. The guru's secrecy and immediacy. The whereabouts of the gurus of our time were always kept in the strictest secrecy. They were the ones who traveled alone. No one knew when they left or when they came or at which monastery they would be next. Through this strict secrecy of the guru's whereabouts, his life and his physical body was preserved into great longevity. All Shaivite monastics were taught to look within themselves for their guru and to always feel him living in the monastery where they were. They were always discouraged in looking for the guru as a physical person outside of themselves, and so he is always discussing among them as being a part of their monastery, living in their monastery, and never discussed or thought of traveling from one monastery to another. This is strictly adhered to, as all monastics are trained to think within the monastery walls, not outside of them. Only in this way can the work of the alignment of the three worlds be constantly performed. The gurus, however, within themselves, carried each monastery constantly within them as one person, and within their minds they lived in each one simultaneously through this method. The guru's unified perspective. Therefore there was no individual head other than the guru, who is absolute head of many monasteries, constantly in touch with one Ganesha. Though he may be speaking with one Ganesha in the form of one monastic in each monastery, to him it is only one Ganesha, one Vadivel, one Hanuman, one Deva, and one senior minority group, one artisan, one executive, one Brahmin, one Mohan, one Swami, one Darshan, and he holds this within him wherever he is. This is the secret of the gurus of our era, and one of the main ways in which a guru was able to be head of and administrate 40, 50, 60 monasteries, allowing the deity Lord Skanda to manifest the culture teachings and the new innovations in science through the darshan, and the monastics from deep within the mind. Lord Shiva governed the great darshan flow through the guru, and often for long periods of time the only one contact a guru had on the physical plane with his monastics was through the one Ganesha. Often in the guru's inner mind, if he had 50 monastics and 40 of them were in a perfect flow, the entire 40 would represent one person to him, and sometimes the entire 50. This was the real state for a Shiavite guru to manifest for his monasteries. The Swamis and mature Brahmins, inspired by Lord Ganesha, would work personally with the monks, enlightening them in the philosophies and guiding their writings. Lord Hanuman empowered the senior group member, known himself as the Hanuman, commissioned to speak with groups and the entire monastery. Goddess Sarasvati, Lord of Learning, was ever present as the Deva, humbly inquired of artisans regarding the training of their apprentices and how the various divine services were being fulfilled. The youngest within the monastery, the Vadivel, guided by Lord Murugan, worked alone through the night, analyzing special wooden sticks the monks carried, determining their seniority in the monastery and their place on the almost invisible governing group called the senior minority. Om. Subtle was the regulation of the group, impersonal and unobtrusive, revolving around the Satgurus, who in those days were self-efficient and in supreme command. They ruled subtly, remaining in the background of their many monasteries, working through one person, the Ganesha of the senior group. Their governing of the four winds and the methods of atonement were unfailing and fair. Gurudeva. Chapter 20. Monastery Customs. The senior minority group always kept themselves a little apart from the other members of the monastery, and sometimes even lived together in a separate area of the monastery. They kept apart mainly by their attitudes, and this enabled them better to understand how the inner force fields of the monastery were behaving. Constant philosophical discussion. In the larger monasteries, often some of the most senior monastics of the senior minority group would all the time be walking through it, engaging others in philosophical discussion. Philosophical discussion was important in all Shaivite monasteries, as when the harmony of it began to occur between two or more, many devas on the inner plane would hover around and send blessings through these Shaivite souls, and often the discussions would be heard by others at great distances through the inner ears. The inner darshan of the devas, the deities, and the guru himself would merge as one great darshan flow out through the senior minority group in the totality of the monastery, its population, and to those who lived surrounding the monastery. The darshan, as well as the kamaba, rested equally and was shared by each member of the senior one-third minority of each monastery, sticks indicating seniority. Each monastic kept track of his monastic age by placing notches in the stick that he carried with him. His physical age, brahmacharya age, and time in our individual monastery would be kept in this way through notching the stick. Each time he entered a new monastery while sitting by the wall, he would prepare a new stick and discard the old one. One could actually tell by the age of his stick whether he had lived in the monastery a long time or not, as he carried it with him all the time. It represented to him the ray of the light he traveled on while coming to this planet, and he was always seen with it in his hands, meditating on this ray of light which emanated back into the central sun. Occasionally monastics would dance and clap their sticks together. Vaudeville calculates the OTM. Wherever there was a change within the monastery's population, someone came or left, each monastic would leave his stick, together with all the others at a certain place, so that the vaudeville could separate them through analyzing the monastic age and duration of his time within the monastery walls, to find the one-third minority of them all. This often took the vaudeville far into the night, preparing the next senior minority group, and in the morning each one would choose his stick again and carry this wand away, knowing full well whether he was to polarize the darshan or not. Formula of residency and monastic age. All kinds of activity that would lift the ego in the vaudeville were given to him, for the ego comes from the animal nerve system, whereas nothing would be given to the rest of the monastery that would lift the ego in any way. It was subdued but not suppressed. And so it was the vaudeville that calculated the senior minority group, chose the Uma Ganesha, the Hanuman, the Uma Deva, each time the comings and goings within the monastery, and Devasthanam occurred. He used a simple formula to calculate and determine who they were. He would first determine how many were living within the monastery in Devasthanam, and then subtract 1/3 of that number. That would tell him how many sticks represented the resident seniority in the monastery. His next calculation would be to choose 1/2 of this remaining group, and this would be determined by monastic age. The most senior in the monastic age would be the half that represented the senior minority group. If there was a tie between two members, the brahmacharya age would be looked at. The most senior would be chosen. If there was a tie here as well, the physical age would be looked at, and the oldest would be chosen. Occasionally, but not too often, the vaudeville made an error in his calculations. If it was discovered, it was always overlooked as divine providence of the trident. Residency determines duties. The Uma Ganesha is chosen through the arrangement of the circle. The seating occurs because of the resident age within the monastery itself. The oldest resident is the Uma Ganesha, the youngest the Uma Deva. The one on the left of the Uma Ganesha is the second in residency. If there were a tie in Uma Ganesha or any one of this group, then the monastic age would settle the question. The most senior would take precedence. If this also tied, then brahmacharya years and physical years were consulted. Applying tapas instead of discipline. The senior minority group never disciplined anyone, though they did correct to try to bring each one into line with the shastras that governed our culture. If someone was out of harmony within the monastery, he was out of harmony with his guru, and it was recommended through the Uma Ganesha to the guru that one kind or another of tapas be given to him. Tapas and discipline always come from the guru. The senior group always approached the entire population in the monastery from the perspective that each one arrived on this planet in a perfect state, and if anything was askew within anyone, it was because of some external thing that came to him from this planet. It was not inherent in themselves, but simply had to be dealt with. And so if problems occurred, they would recommend certain prescribed kinds of tapas as remedies, and if the guru acquiesced, tapas was given and the matter righted itself. 3 kinds of Dravidian tapas. Three of the basic kinds of tapas given are called Dravidian tapas. Sitting alone by oneself for long periods of time, breathing and waiting while the devas in the second world heal and harmonize the forces was one. Another was walking for long periods of time alone, with the devas in the second world running along beside him, breathing and refraining from thinking, but simply feeling the forces of the body. And the other was called the quest for the guru. A monastic would be sent away from the monastery to find and travel with his guru. The gurus of our time worked with his tapas, trying to always avoid them, hide from them, until such a time they let themselves be found. Then he would travel for a time with his guru, and he left alone at one of the monasteries. Senior minority meetings. Every member of each senior group were all of one area of the mind. They would rarely discuss anything, just look at each other, know, and nod. Each individual spokesman of the winds would just speak out. The Uma Ganesha, in a quiet, humble way, would guide the meeting along, and when they met, everything was there. The darshan was there, the problems were there, the deity was there, the devas were there, the guru was there. They were amazingly of one mind. When tapas was given, it was always given by the guru and ended by him, either in person, but more often through one of the spokesmen of the senior minority group. He instructed the Uma Ganesha. The Uma Ganesha always conveyed the guru's instructions to the entire group, and then, either privately or in the group, told the Uma Deva and the Hanuman how the guru wished his instructions to be carried out. And so we see that the Uma Ganesha, in his wisdom and compassion, was the spokesman of the guru and nothing more. Routine, simple and easygoing. In large monasteries, the senior minority met regularly, at least 4 or 5 times each moon. In small monasteries, they would have to meet for long periods each day, sometimes twice a day. Meetings were always scheduled by the Uma Ganesha under the instruction of the guru, who would set the pattern of the formula each monastery was to function under. All monastic problems were handled by the devas or the guru, and it was only those who performed good sadhana by the walls who were allowed to enter the monastery. And so the daily routine was easily going, simple yet lively, with a lot of force for the fulfillment of the mission, but no real complications or congested forces ever occurred, because of the immediate residency, and everyone had enough time for everything. The senior group never made decisions on previous flows or routines that had been established or tried to alter them in any way. Each one was so highly trained, this was not necessary. In the larger monasteries, they just gave approval or disapproval to the timing of events and looked after how these events were being handled, especially if they were ones that did not occur too often. The main duties of the Hanuman. It was the Hanuman and his assistants who coordinated from the core of the monastery out, way beyond the wall, into the Devasthanam, all of the activities and events of various and varied natures, especially those that were not in the total direction of an executive, artisan, Brahmin, Mohan, or Swami, and he would fill in for any one of them to see to the smooth flow of their duties if they were transferred from one monastery to another. He performed his work in an unseen way. No one knew who the Hanuman was, and sometimes in an important event, the Hanuman would form a committee of other members, and there would be under his direction 4 or 5 Hanumans within the monastery handling the event. Hanuman's flow of information. Those within the Devasthanam seeking entrance were closely watched by the Hanuman, and their needs were always met in unseen ways. Occasionally he would work with the Umadeva, and groups would be spoken to and individuals simultaneously after the group meeting in this way. But of course they never initiated anything. His instructions came from the Uma Ganesha, who in his wisdom received his instructions from the Shastras and our Guru. Speaking out but not being known. In a large Shaivite monastery, Mohans of the East Wind would speak to the entire monastery occasionally and talk of monastic life and occurrences and activities within our monasteries. Swamis of the East Wind would speak of the philosophy as well as mature Brahmins. The Hanuman would also speak, as well as the artisans would address their apprentices as well as others. In monasteries such as these it was not difficult to speak, as well as not to be known, and in these large monasteries no one knew or cared actually who was in the senior group. The activity and attention was placed elsewhere. Adjustment of OTM members. Our Shaivite gurus could change, for reasons of their own, different members of the senior minority group by simply moving a few new sadhakas into the monastery, taking out a few, or putting someone into mahatapas, or reducing, because of another type of tapas, monastic age to 6 years old. In this way, they could balance the forces if the senior group or any member of it were becoming out of harmony with the responsibility of polarizing so much of the darshan, or for any other reason. There were such humble souls and inwardly expressive that their gatherings were inspirational to each and every one of them. On rare occasions when they met, the many within the monastery would feel the vibration and sit and meditate. To eliminate more of the animal nature in this great priesthood, many kinds of different names were given, names with and without meaning to the individuals, and these names would be changed occasionally, especially during the time they lived by the wall. Training young monastics. The senior minority group was primarily concerned with the training of the monastics, and through the great calendar log at regular intervals, the Umadeva would be sent on tour through the monastery to inquire from the artisan and the new monastic himself as to how his training was being attended to. Making his own observations as well, he would always do this incognito, of course, and in a very humble, quiet way. If the training was not properly being done, the artisan or executive would be called to meet with the senior minority group to seek solutions to the problem. They knew that the first 3 months after entering the monastery were the most important for a new monastic, and if he was tended well during that time, everything would go well with him from that time. The Umadeva or his assistant hovered close to new monastics for their first 3 moons, sometimes giving daily reports as to their proper orientation. However, no training or concern was given to anyone within the Devasthanam seeking entrance into the monastery. Orienting monastic newcomers. Regularly, the Hanuman or his assistant would speak to the entire group, as would others who spoke to groups. Most of the monastic orientation has already been given to those who entered the Devasthanam from the family they had been living with, studying, learning, and preparing themselves with. It was felt that a newcomer into the monastery may be a guru or a god in disguise. The gurus of our time were often traveling around, entering the monasteries of other gurus as new monastics. They did this in order to allow themselves time to work inwardly and to help the guru whose monastery they entered, as well as these gurus gathered together in inner conclave in the second world to plan their strategy. Among the broader community, senior minority groups in the monasteries faced other kinds of problems as well. Acquisition of land, building of buildings, all had to be taken care of without upsetting or disturbing the darshan flow. Many tribes were forming at this time, and it was necessary to send swamis into these tribal areas to teach the most outstanding leaders, so that they could pass it on to those about them. Other problems too, such as negotiation for water, seeing to the flow of food and gold, which was very important and helped to hold the vibration of the darshan in the temple, existed. They also had to prove themselves to the tribal community that they could maintain the monastery in good order, so that the community would come, sit by the wall, and listen to the dissertations of teaching through the holes in it. When the monasteries were formed, it was the most senior 1/3 of the senior minority group of each of the guru's monasteries that would become the new residents of the new one. This might occur every 3 or 4 years. This selection of monastics would give all the power necessary to form a new monastery, because they took with them some of the power from all of the other monasteries. The guru may work within the new monastery or never enter it until it's well established, but work with them from a distance. Also, their most senior monastics knew how to prove themselves to the surrounding community for the first 3 or 4 years, as well as bring in new sadhakas into the monastery. In 4 years, when the monastery monastery was well-founded and artisans had been brought from other monasteries, these senior members would begin to leave, allowing the growth to come from those who had been entered into the monastery during that time. Prudence was the hallmark of each member of the monastery's senior minority, striving to be perfect in his personal life, behavior, craft, or area of service. Perfection was that which can be carried into the inner world for a lengthy stay. Elders realized this more than the others, for they conclaved in deep togetherness, supervising every artisan's training of his apprentices and observing closely the results. Correction was freely given and deemed necessary even by those who received it, yet the attitude that nothing was amiss all preceded all others. While others were trainees, seniors were the monastery itself, wisely watching from afar as artisans made corrections. They had a responsibility to become, remain, and thereafter be the perfect examples of the guiding Shastras. Om. Unremitting training was highly valued in the monasteries, all toward protecting and strengthening the darshan, which encompassed the sight, the feelings which sight produced, and the divine energies thus transmitted. New monasteries were carefully begun with senior members from established monasteries helping. Always the senior group mentioned the energies without correction. Guru Deva. Chapter 21. Training and Discipline. Occasionally a group of devoted brahmachari men would gather together and obtain the blessings from their guru to live the Shastras and form a Sadhaka monastery. Their guru would occasionally visit, encourage, and instruct. He took this as his personal responsibility and worked with it until it was well established. This is the second of the two ways a Shaivite monastery could be begun, as the Shaivite Shastras contain all the controls necessary so that each aspect of monastic living was performed correctly in adherence to the definite pattern, and our tradition and culture blended easily into this. It was not complicated for a group of sincere souls to begin a Shaivite monastery as Sadhakas in white. Senior members entering new monasteries. When a Sadhaka monastery became fairly well adjusted to the intricacies of the Shaivite Shastras, their guru might send a delegation from the senior minority group of several of the surrounding monasteries to live by their wall, seek entrance, blend into, and later help and serve in the new Sadhaka monastery. Because of their monastic years, each one in this delegation would soon be in the senior minority group, thus affecting a balance of force. The number sent from each monastery would depend upon the number of Sadhakas within the new one. It may be one monastic from each senior minority group, 2 or more, but rarely, if ever, exceeding more than 1/3 of the count within the Sadhaka monastery. Often their guru would go and live with this sincere group of Sadhakas and personally help them with every phase, and while he was there he would assist his senior monastics from other monasteries with their entrance through the wall, who would later represent him in the senior minority group when he left. Routines and divine innovations. As the monastery flow was handled according to specific routine, which, when learned, was always performed in approximately the same way, for no new innovations were entered into it, unless they came directly from our deity or the guru himself. The gurus of our time never discussed anything with anyone, except possibly the deity. Their dictates were activated as carefully and as precisely as was possible through each monastery, and the senior minority group was held responsible to this by the guru, the deity and devas in the second and the third world. So it was because of this that a new monastery was easy to form. In the beginning of the formation of a new Sadhaka monastery, the guru himself would talk personally with each Sadhaka, adjusting and explaining the attitudes that he was to hold. But as soon as the senior minority group became stable and strong, he would speak to the monastics through his Uma Ganesha, who would in turn employ the services of the Hanuman and Umadeva to disseminate his word. Training in precision for sublimity. The senior minority groups were very careful that each member of the monastery was well trained and that each innovation their guru made was carried straight through in full, immediate cooperation from each member of the monastery. And when each one was expertly trained in his duty and chore, it was a rare occurrence that this did not happen. The senior minority group would use hours in explaining and training new monastics, as well as supervising artisans and executives in their procedures of training and observing closely the results obtained. For they well knew that the well-trained intellect did not inhibit the darshan flow, and that when each monastic was well-trained, it would last within him, develop within him year after year, and flow through his life in the monastery he was trained in, or he would enhance any monastery he pilgrimaged to. Once trained, he was never trained again, and after approximately 14 monastic years had passed, he settled down to a precise routine, always remembering that the dissemination of the darshan as a pure channel was his major chore. Preparing for impending darkness. We are all aware that at this time that the darkness of the mind is nearing and about to encompass the population of this planet through the Kali Yuga, and how important it is to preserve our message and our culture for as long as possible, and impose these notes into the Akashic ether to be read at a later time when the darkness begins to wane. It was because of this that at every opportunity our gurus founded new monasteries and sadhaka groups gathered upon their own motivations to assist them in their work. Assistance for personal difficulties. When a Shaivite monastic had a problem within his mind, or a misunderstanding while he adjusted to his training occurred, his artisan or executive, along with all of the other apprentices, would go within the temple, and before our deity a ceremony would occur to lift the vibration of darkness that surrounded him into one of the light. If anyone other than our gurus ever lectured to correct it or disciplined some one of us, it was always done in private through the artisan or the executive, if they were qualified to correct, or through the Umadeva or the Hanuman. Our innate perfection. No discipline or correction ever came in the presence of the senior minority group toward any monastic. Interviews of this nature were always privately held and in secrecy. This was to avoid too much thought force by the entire group upon a single monastic, and if he were out of harmony with his guru, tapas was simply given to him to make a part of his life and correct his situation. The attitude of arriving back to our original state, and that nothing was actually amiss, always preceded all others, for we were perfect when we arrived on this planet to evolve. Most of our difficulties are because of the nature of the external nerve system and the motivating forces of these bodies that we currently inhabit. Some of us have never evolved through the animal kingdom. Refined living in mature monasteries. After a monastery established by either one or two of these methods was smoothly transformed from a training school into a way of life by the senior minority group, and the artisans and executives had been well chosen within the monastery itself and brought together from neighboring ones, the senior minority group had little to do other than concern themselves with those coming from the wall into the monastery and upgrading the philosophical precision and way of life in adherence to the shastras within the monastery itself. Surprise philosophical exams. Occasionally a monastic resident would be asked without warning to sit with the OTM and receive a more intricate philosophical and shastric examination as to his personal life and knowledge as to how he should conduct himself under the way possible circumstances that could arise in his present surroundings and his future life while on the mission for his guru, or pilgrimaging from monastery to monastery. The intricacies of his training, as outlined in the great book of Shaivite monastic attitudes, was well taught through this method, and it was before a monastic was transferred to another monastery that he was also given ceremony and blessing by the senior minority group, as well as an examination and instruction as to how he was to behave and conduct himself in the monastery that he would be begging admittance to. It was in this way that Shaivite monastics continued the Lemurian cultural standards for the entire community surrounding each temple and monastery, and if the senior minority group felt that the darshan was not reaching or penetrating deeply enough into the villages surrounding us, more ceremony, more puja, more tapas was performed to draw forth a greater darshan, to correct and uplift the situation. Guarding the psychic force field. In their living in the third eye, constant surveillance occurred. Occasionally, they would see a disincarnate animal in the second world enter the monastery, and because of this surveillance, he was fought with through puja and dismissed from our force field easily before causing psychic harm to any of the beginning sadhakas. They would sit together, often without discussion, just to tightly hold this darshan as a collective group, as a chakram, for by being together, the inner bones of their bodies became the chakram for the deity and his devas to send great cosmic rays through, a chakram of divine upliftment. They also knew that by just their being together, the devas would be able to adjust the monastic flows and bring individual sadhakas and initiates into a greater knowledge by using the force they generated by sitting together. During these times, our deities and devas would project great and colorful rays through the entirety of their nerve systems. These rays would flow out through the entire monastery, adjusting and correcting the most subtle of issues. They acted as the hub, motionless. The other activities occurred around them, and at certain times our guru would sit with this group to adjust the force field during this changing era of our time. Implementing without ramifying. It was for this reason that any change or alteration in the general flow of the monastery or the timing of an event, even if our guru instigated it, had to have a unanimous nod of approval from this senior group. If the discussion occurred more than a moment or so, the matter was referred to our guru for elucidation, for we are just a channel for the deity, a dispenser, a container, a holder of darshan. We endeavor not to lower his vibration into the intellect of words and discussion, other than to convey information of which our answers are found quickly within our shastras and from our guru. The pattern was set long ago, and to fulfill it is our function. It was in the second world, with the devas and our guru at night, when we all slept on these inner planes, that discussion occurred, clarification was given. This is why when issues arose, we informed the devas in writing through the sacred fire and met with them there, for our senior circle met in two worlds, and so in the first world we always endeavored to sit and feel what had occurred the night before, and it was through feeling that the unanimous nod of approval or disapproval occurred. The OTM's requisite aloofness. On occasion, when there was congestion within the monastery due to the diminishing force of the imposing Kali Yuga, we would hold ourselves apart, even live separately within the monastery to equalize the pressures. The senior care eliminated close. The senior core never mixed closely with sadhakas in white other than being friendly, courteous, and kind, nor did they mix closely with newcomers or guests, except for the Hanuman, who initially interviewed, hosted, got to know them, and was then able to inform the senior core about them. The unfailing power to add or detract. It was the comings and goings of sadhakas, initiates, and guests that changed the force field the most, and therefore always greatly concerned the senior core of each monastery, for they knew how things should be, and their mission was to constantly refine, the shastric flows and structures. And because of this constant upgrading of Shaivite living, it was the newcomer who would add or detract, depending upon the quality of his being, his ability to change and adjust. For all of our monasteries, though the same, are different because of the conglomerate of souls in the first, second, and third worlds working within them. Therefore, each monastic's great endeavor by the wall is to adjust himself to this similar but new and different vibration he encounters. When the darshan was strongest, the darshan at times would become so strong that each monastic could do nothing but sit, absorb it, disseminate it. It was during these times that the devas from several monasteries moved to a single one to cause a certain impact to equalize the force of the surrounding population. And at these times each monastic acted as he would if he were within the senior minority group, as a great chakram from the divine darshan. This would come unannounced, never lasting too long, and would leave quickly. It was in this way that the second and third world controlled the instinctive forces within the animal bodies of us in the first. The members of the monastery's senior minority were very careful that each member of the monastery was well trained, and that the guru had full and immediate cooperation from each monastic in making manifest his word. The senior group also supervised the artisans with their training of the apprentices and observed closely the results obtained. Correction was freely given, but the attitude that nothing was amiss always preceded all others. Obedience, intelligent cooperation was the keynote. The senior group and the artisans took time with each young apprentice, especially in the first few years, knowing that with a well-trained intellect he would enhance the darshan flow for the remainder of his life. The foremost lesson was that disseminating and being a channel for the divine energies is each one's major chore. Om. Venerable monasteries and their surrounding communities lived smoothly together up to this time, but as they advanced deeper into the Kali Yuga, conditions changed as unrestrained mating, land division by impenetrable oceans, and misunderstandings arose. Being on the wall was intricate to monastic culture, protecting those within from forces on the outside, often guided by dreams. Gurudeva.